Sir, thanks for joining me on the podcast. We've been threading the needle, making this happen. So I appreciate you taking the time. You got a few things you're juggling.
You bet, Rain. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this for all of those folks that are interested in this awesome way to spend a chapter of their lives.
Well, I would say you have a couple chapters looking at your bio, which I'm going to hit some highlights here. We might have to do round two of this, just looking at this. But currently, Lieutenant General Dan Razin Caine, you are the Associate Director for Military Affairs at the Central Intelligence Agency. You started your career off flying the mighty Viper, the Air National Guard. We definitely have to talk about your journey through that because I think it's quite interesting. But throughout your time, you've gone to weapons school, you've been the SCUD project officer, United Central Command, which seems like that might have started trickling your way into special operations. But in that time, you've also served at the Air National Guard Test Center out in Tucson, which I just hear great things. It sounds like that's a really good job.
It was awesome.
But after that, you kind of trickled into the joint world, the special operations world, and then eventually winding your time up there in Washington, D.C., which we can talk about a few things. Long career. And as I hear you're getting ready to hang up the straps for this job currently, who knows? Maybe, I don't know if you're retiring, moving on to something else. But again, thanks for taking the time to be here today, and look forward to chatting a little bit more.
Same here. I'm honored to be here.
Well, I would like to kick it off. This is something new. You're the first one I've done this with. So I have Patreon supporters who support the podcast. I let them know that you're coming on the podcast and give them the opportunity if they wanted to ask any questions. And I thought there was one in particular that was pretty good. If we can kick it off with that, and then we'll roll from there. But this is from Niels. He's been supporting the podcast for a while. He just recently retired. But he said, Sir, as someone myself who has worked in the conventional and special operations world in all three components, the active, the National Guard, and the reserve component, and this is the Army, what's the biggest challenge, or the biggest challenge he's seen is the information sharing, both technical architecture as well as the rice bowl protection piece of it. Can you share your thoughts on how we can do a better job sharing information and interoperability across the joint force and all three components and interagency relationships based on the seat that you hold today? So, softball question.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the question from, I think he said his name was Niels. You know, the importance of sharing information now is really critical. And whether it's, highly classified information or just routine information, our team and the teams in the joint force right now are really committed to figuring out what has to be true for folks to share information at the time that risk holders are thinking about plans and activities or con ops or whatever, not at the point where we're in a gunfight somewhere. And, there's a lot of great case studies coming out of Desert Storm where folks showed up with highly classified information that was never integrated into anybody's ops plans or practiced or rehearsed with. And so, both in my last job when I was running all of DoD's special access programs to this current job that I'm at CIA, I think leaders both in the joint force and in the interagency are committed to breaking down those stovepipes that we've all struggled with over many years, and to share information at the point that people are thinking about things. It's hard sometimes because there are things that we have to protect, like sources and methods, and those things will never go away. But you can share a lot more probably than we think we can. And so it's really about having a trusting and entrepreneurial spirit between teammates and figuring out how to share that information when we need to. So it's a great question, and hopefully we'll keep chewing away at it.
Do you think, I feel like after 9/11, one of the big highlights of creating the Department of Homeland Security was the stovepipes of information where that information was not flowing across. Now, granted, 9/11, your time, which we're going to talk about, you were doing a different role, but in your time kind of in the special operations, especially the joint world, did you see any stovepipes or hurdles to that information sharing?
Sure. Yeah. And, I think we were pretty good in the CT days where we were all deploying together and going to places like Balad or Kandahar or Bagram. And, as we left those places, I think we need to be committed now more than ever to continuing those habitual trusting relationships between the CAF, the Joint SOF community, and the interagency more than ever. I mean, I won't get into particular examples because that would exceed this conversation, and we'd all go to jail. Yeah. But sure, there's been case studies of where we could have done better. But I think we're on the right path, Rain. We can't give up. We got to keep our foot on the gas and the throttle up forward on information sharing and be very proactive, not reactive about getting risk holders in particular, ground force commanders, mission commanders, air battle managers, leaders who own risk, getting them the information when they're starting to think about these things, not at the point that they're defensive somewhere. If we've done that, we've failed.
Absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that. So I would like to back it up to where it all began for Razin. Where'd you grow up? What was your path to getting into the Air Force?
Yeah. Well, I grew up as the son of a fighter pilot. This was our family business. My dad started out as a school teacher, and my mom was a nurse, and she bought him some flying lessons, and he absolutely was addicted to flying airplanes, and she paid for all of his ratings. And then he wanted to become an airline pilot and tried to join the airlines. Didn't work out. So he came in the Air Force thinking that he wanted to fly the C-5 Galaxy. And then he hit the T-38 and said, I don't want to do this. I want to fly F-Force. And so my dad ended up flying F-Force. He went to Southeast Asia as a baby lieutenant in the 8th TAC Fighter Squadron, the Black Sheep, that became near and dear to our family. From there, he was the initial cadre in the Mighty Viper. He was one of 4 guys picked to fly the F-16 first. They picked a F-4 weapons officer, my dad. They picked an aggressor, a legendary F-16 driver named John Skidmore. They picked an RTU guy who many of us who flew the F-16 know, a guy named Skip Hopler, who passed away recently, who was out at Luke, and they picked an A-7 guy. And those 4 young captains went out to Edwards and checked out in the jet. And so we started moving around as a kid. And so I felt like this was something that I really, really, really wanted to do was fly jets in the Air Force. And after graduating from Hahn High School, where my dad was a squadron commander in the 496 TAC Fighter Squadron, I went to college in Virginia and did ROTC and then ended up being lucky enough, very lucky, based on my very marginal GPA, to go to pilot training in Texas.
That, to me, your dad's story in and of itself, and that time period, the fact that he ended up flying fighters is a pretty cool aspect of it. Especially, I imagine it wasn't super popular to try and go run and join the military at that time frame. Did you ever talk to him about what his kind of thought process was? He just wanted to fly so bad it didn't matter what it was, or?
Well, I mean that, but more importantly, I think he had clarity on what it meant to be an American, and it was not easy. I mean, our family, I won't get into the family dynamics, but we had other folks in his personal family that didn't see the war in Vietnam quite the same way. And so, I think it was tough on him, but he had clarity of purpose. He had a real sense of who he was. And so he went off to fly. It's funny that the whole wing deployed out of Holloman. We were living at Holloman Air Force Base. And in one day, they deployed 4 fighter squadrons to try to signal the Russians. 3 fighter squadrons left their punks home. 1 fighter squadron took their punks, the Black Sheep, and it changed those 4 lieutenants' lives forever. They didn't have call signs back then, but they called them dumb shit 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I think he was dumb shit 4. But they paired him up with experienced Wizzos. And my dad's Wizzo was a guy named Nolan Schmidt, who was probably a slick wing Wizzo captain who'd had his first tour flying in A-26s working the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And Nolan was a pretty cool customer to have in the back seat of that F-4D as they worked mostly night sorties up there doing casts and interdiction along the trail. But when I think about what right looks like, when we go to war these days, we got NVGs and data links and precision weapons and electronic warfare capability, and we've flown a lot at night. And between those guys in Vietnam and then the World War II aviators, I mean, you want to just look for the gift of a good example. Go look at those folks.
I often think when I'm crossing the pond, especially out there in the Pacific, and there's just nothing, like, could I imagine being in a P-38 taking off and just cruising to go find some
pulling it back and trying to get as much gas as you can out of this? I mean, it's whenever we think we're badasses, we just need to take a minute and just think about them, and that'll humble us out pretty damn quickly. So I don't forget our roots and where that came from, but that helped put me on a trajectory to really want to be part of a world-class team in a fighter squadron. When I was pretty early, from my earliest memories, I wanted to have the opportunity to fly.
Well, look at your bio. You go from Shepherd Air Force Base, Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training, to the Syracuse Air National Guard. Not normally a normal trajectory. So how did that work out?
Yeah, these I went to pilot training a long time ago, Rain.
What was your class number?
I don't want to tell you that, man. The wheelchair's just outside of view. So, no, I was 9302, and so we were right out of Desert Storm, and when I showed up flying the Mighty Tweet in the 38, about halfway through pilot training, they were clearly messaging that there were going to be no actual airplanes, and that we were all going to go to desk jobs in this program called banked fighters, where after a couple years and crushing it at whatever job that you would have, you would in theory come back to flying airplanes. And while I believed them, and many of my pilot training buddies went off to have fantastic careers flying fighters, for whatever reason, I felt like it was, and they were clearly saying they were going to let a bunch of people go too. So, about halfway through 37s and 38s, I went home one night after being at the O Club and got out my typewriter, because I had a typewriter, and I wrote a resume and a cover letter. And my cover letter said, "Dear selection person, all I've ever wanted to do in my entire life is be a snacko. I've trained for this moment. There are 1,964 ounces of beer in a U.S. keg. I will never run out of popcorn," which I did later on, "or coffee, and I will not talk on the radio." And sent that out to 85, I think it was 80, 85 at the time, bunch more than we have now, Guard and reserve units that were flying anything from A-10s to, I think an OV-10 unit maybe still. And in between 37s and 38s, that letter I sent was while I was still in tweets. And then I took my tweet check ride and walked to the parking lot and got in my Honda Civic, and I drove from Wichita Falls to Syracuse, Vermont, Atlantic City, DC, Richmond, Kelly, and back in the space of a week. While you had your sort of transition leave between 37s and 38s. And ultimately, the 174th Fighter Wing, the Syracuse Air National Guard, had a guy or gal, I don't remember, not make it to get FAR'd, and had an opening for a JO, and took a huge risk on me and hired me at the end of pilot training to come to Syracuse as a young F-16 pilot. I still can't believe they took a risk on me.
Look at you now.
I mean, I just saw all these folks recently and had the chance to tell them again, thank you. And that was super uncharted waters for them. So it was no pun intended, but great of them to do that.
Well, it's going because obviously Slough connected us, which I do appreciate that. Looking at your bio, to me, it tells a tale of someone kind of pushing their own path, or not always walking the traditional path, especially for Air National Guard, or even starting out in an active duty component. But the aspect here, there are a lot of, I think, people listen that are pursuing careers in the Guard or Reserve. Now there's services like Bogey Dope out there, which I think is great, helping young dudes and dudettes get into the path and figure out who's hiring now, what the process is, like kind of peeling back the curtain a little bit and helping through the process. But in 1993, 1992, not necessarily the case. How did you even go about finding, like, even the mailing addresses of these units? That's a drive.
I found somewhere a list of every Guard and Reserve unit in the country, and it had a phone number, and I called every single one of them, man. And I got the address and got their mailing address and the name of their ops officer. I wish I still had that hard copy blue. I still remember the sort of dark blue. There was an F-15 on the cover of this thing. Joking to the Eagle folks, but seriously. And it was just covered with notes, and I would do that on early in the morning or late at night where I wouldn't interfere and just ground it out. I think that's one of the things that was a gift to me, is just the sort of mindset around, hey, only you can do these things. Nobody's going to hand these things to you. And if there's something you really want to do and you believe that this is the right path for you, get off your rear end and start moving towards that objective and be tenacious. And the path to the Guard was not easy. Nobody'd done this. And so, I still remember I'm on step 1 of my 12-step recovery process. I go into my squadron commander, who was an Italian, and he's great. And we have a glass of wine. He signs my Palace Chase or Palace Front. I don't even remember the name of the program application. And he says, good luck, buongiorno. Your next stop is the wing commander. And I won't mention who it is. And the wing commander had flown with my old man. And I went into the wing commander's office, reported in, and he lost his mind and threw me out of the office, and would not sign my piece of paper, and told me I was a quitter. And so I sort of go back to the flight room and process all this over the next few days. And at this point, man, I've committed, right? I've shown my cards. And so, young Dan Caine, not the smartest kid out there, Rain. I go back in for a second time. This time though, I've got, Guard and Reserve contribution numbers to Desert Storm, mission ready rates. I'm awash with facts around the Joint Force and the value proposition that the Guard and Reserve brings to the table, thinking naively that I can convince this senior leader of the value of the total force, and he loses his mind again. So I'm not really, I'm not telling my dad any of this because I don't believe in doing that. So after a few weeks now I'm really committed. I mean, it's a little further in 38s. I'm doing okay. There's been a lot of messaging around the shrinking of the Air Force at the time. I go back in for a third time, and I don't know what changed. I'd never told anybody about this, but he signed my paperwork. But there's so many stories like that I've been very lucky. Ultimately, if he'd not signed it, I would have gone and done whatever. I don't want people to think that I wasn't committed to service. I think, and believe, and still believe I was very committed to service. I just felt like, for whatever reason, my young 22, 23-year-old self thought going to the total force reserve component was a better path for me, although I've sort of bounded back and forth through my career.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it seems like it worked out. You got to wonder there if it's probably, if it's numbers or if it's just passion, the fact that he had obviously spent probably 20 plus years already on active duty where he didn't want to sign that. But I can see pushing your own rope. My story, which is, I mean, very dimly compares, but I think it's a testament because people listen, like, I never take no for an answer, right? There's always a different path. So always ask the question, get a second opinion, et cetera. When they were doing casual status at other bases. So I got sent down to Moody Air Force Base.
Yeah.
Born and raised in Georgia. I've never been to Valdosta at this point. I probably can point to the southern part of Georgia and get close to it at this point of where Valdosta is. But they sent us to ASBC at Maxwell. I had my orders going to the 347th OSS. The internet, the Air Force.
Me too. That's where I thought I was going banked also, was to Moody.
Valdosta is a great town. But I did 15 months there. It was a great year, but I looked on the Air Force website and, bases were all at this point just kind of starting to get them or pay attention to it. And I saw what units were there. I'm like, the 41st Rescue Squadron, that's HA-60. That looks pretty cool. Somehow found a number. It's the ops desk. Some lieutenant who just showed up from Pavehawk School answers it. And I'm like, hey, I have orders down to Moody. He goes, wow, I'll be your sponsor. So he becomes my sponsor. I show up like 2 weeks later. I'm in the squadron for like 10 days. Half the squadron's deployed. There's an 05 as like an ADO who's running it. And they start assigning me. I become the snacko, sitting at the ops desk, doing whatever menial task.
Is this after pilot training?
This is before pilot training. So okay. I'm waiting. I have to wait.
So you're stacked waiting to go to UPT.
Waiting to go. Now they might have changed it again, but for at least I was one of the last. Our group was the last group because the following year they just started either sending them straight to pilot training and they would do whatever work around the base. Yeah. And then they started just delaying entry. So I had initially they fragged me for like a 6-month delayed entry into active duty, and they bumped it up to that was 30 days. So it worked out. But I show up down there, I'm in the squadron, and then one of the group meetings, they're like, "Hey, where's this like Lieutenant Waters? We have not seen him. He's lost." So the ADO chimes in. He's like, "He's ours now. Possession's 9/10 of the law." The other guys got sent off to the OSS, and one was like a unit deployment manager. One of them was an exec.
Meanwhile, you're rocking the ops desk.
I'm getting to fly in the HH-60. I'm shooting the minigun. I'm shooting the 50 cal. I'm the survivor out on the range. It was a great experience. But you kind of got like, just own your own destiny there and like push it forward some. So
I got a lot of time for the rescue community. When they were first getting stood up, and the combat rescue officers were just becoming a thing, and I was deployed in end of 02, beginning of 03 to a bear base that I think it's still secret where we were, so I won't mention the where. But the first guys in there were me as the wing weapons officer and a small rescue element with Crow 1, a guy named Vinny Savino, and Crow 2, Terry Johnson, and a legendary chief called Bob Holler and Lee Schaefer. And so this small group of Crows and Jays were there. And if you've ever heard of Charlie, their mascot, who was a Vietnam sort of doll that squadrons try to steal from each other, I was lucky enough to take Charlie on his first combat mission in OIF 1 there. We needed to get Charlie a Viper sortie. He'd seen the Nom, but he'd never seen the mighty Viper. So we took Charlie on a sortie, which was great.
That'd be interesting. Let's divert to that rescue piece. 'Cause I'm thinking 06, 07 time frame, it goes from Special Operations Command out into Air Combat Command. Probably ballparking it. But it sounds like you, in the early days of OIF and probably OEF, maybe not the case, or is all special operations? Can you, I guess, paint the
Yeah.
picture
So
of it
those days, I mean, after 9/11, not long after, a couple of weeks after, our squadron at Andrews, I'd moved from the New York Guard down to the DC Guard and went to weapons school through the DC Guard. And, we were supposed to deploy to do Southern Watch, was our normal AEF rotation. And we weren't sure if we were going to go. We weren't sure if our alert requirements now in the post 9/11 environment would subsume our deployment. We hoped it wouldn't. So there was all kinds of rumors at the time flowing around. So my leadership sent me to deploy. And so in October, November, I don't remember exactly when, not long after 9/11, I deployed to Jabber to be the 332nd Air Expeditionary Group Wing Weapons Officer, and started flying pretty quickly and doing a variety of different things. We did some interdiction, we did some FACA stuff, but that was really all a air power, soft ground force fight back in 01. And I think through those relationships, that's really the beginning of what changed the heading and direction of my career. And came back after that deployment, and within days of getting back, got tagged by one of my former weapons school instructors, a legendary human named Mark Calvin Klein, who thankfully thought he was going to ACC, but ended up going to CENTAF at the time to be the Master Air Attack Planning Cell Chief, the MAP Cell Chief, and asked me to come down out of the blue. I'd been home for, I think, 3 days at the time, and I came down and got tagged to be the SCUD Hunt Project Officer. And really it was the same players, the 5th Special Forces Group, our UK Special Forces teammates, our Australian Special Forces teammates, that we formed the nucleus of the SCUD Hunt in the early days of 02. And that's really what got me into the SOF community, was relationships and deploying together. And, for those young fighter pilots and warfighters that are out there, it really is all about relationships. So be entrepreneurial. I don't care if you're a SNACO or a young flight lead or a flight commander or a division lead on the Navy or whatever. Be entrepreneurial about those relationships.
Absolutely. The SCUD piece. So the first Gulf War, I remember all the news of SCUDs getting launched, and hunting SCUDs, finding SCUDs, stopping SCUDs was a big deal. Round 2, if you want to call it that, I guess I don't remember seeing Saddam using SCUDs as much or as prevalently. What was going on with that? And that in the second version, I guess, of SCUDs, was it a factor, or did we degrade everything?
I think we ultimately created deterrence. Without getting beyond the scope of classification, it was pretty clear that the Israelis and the Saudis were not going to sit this one out. If they were soaking up, SCUDs from Saddam, I think they were going to take matters into their own hands. And the CENTCOM commander at the time made the decision, along with the National Command Authority, that we needed to have, unlike we did in Desert Storm, which was a very reactive plan, we needed to have a very proactive, thought out, rehearsed, and intentional plan to find, fix, and finish SCUDs prior to their ability to launch. And so, we went to school on how these things work. We went to school on the hundreds and hundreds of hide sites. We brought a small team of US, UK, Australian, and interagency partners together. The first meeting coming out of that, hey, come to Shaw to see me, meeting that I talked about with Calvin Klein was in the basement of the Pentagon with a whiteboard with two legendary weapons officers, sadly both gone now, Cowboy Hughes, who was a Strike Eagle front seater, and a guy named Magic Henderson. And we literally on a whiteboard sketched out what the first ever data link enabled time sensitive targeting structure might be, from the link con ops to roughly how we would task and apportion air power that was set up in an air tasking order. And within days, we went out to Nellis Air Force Base and parked on the other side of the ramp where nobody knew what we were doing out there. And we started practicing in the middle of the night. We would take off at about 1 a.m. when nobody knew what we were doing, and we would go up in the hours of darkness, and we would practice these tactics, techniques, and procedures. It was this small group of people along with a core group from the 422 Test and Evaluation Squadron. It was read on to what it was that we were actually doing. And we did that for a week, and we debriefed all morning long. And then there used to be this club outside the Nellis Gate called the 2-5 Club, and we would go there in the morning and have wings and go to bed. And we did that for a week, and we did it multiple times thereafter. And each time the group grew a little bit. We had a RAF fighter squadron came in. We had, I won't get into the unit particulars, but we had sort of tier 1 folks from the UKSF and the Australian SF show up. And at one point, the chief of the Air Force showed up and just sat there and listened to our brief and watched our execution. And then more senior leaders came in, and we ultimately built a force package that went into that bear base that I talked about with the rescue guys. And it was extraordinary to be a part of. These were world-class professionals who didn't care about who was right, but cared about what was right. And we ultimately executed this on the first night of the war with infiltrating all the special forces folks into where they needed to be to execute this plan. And I think from that readiness, from that approach, we didn't, knock on wood, hopefully Saddam's gone, but there's no more SCUDs out there, but it went well. Most importantly, Rain, we had rehearsed with these folks on the ground a lot, and there became a very tight emotional connection between those of us in the jets and those cats on the ground. And I think when I look back on it, of course, the strategic objective of no SCUD shot was what we wanted to do, but we had over 100 ticks in that period of time, many of them danger close, and we never lost a single person on the ground. That to me is equally important.
Yeah, absolutely. Timestamp this. How far back from OIF starting are you beginning this process and integrating with tier 1 guys and figuring out how to solve this problem?
Yeah, it's probably 10 months total. It was probably, I think the first live fly was March, April of 2002, not long after Anaconda. It was within several weeks of me getting back. And so I think the first live fly was probably April, and then we did another one in the summer. We did another one in the fall. They were about every 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Red flag was great. We built a TST cell, which had world-class humans in it, including a great leader named Craig Franklin. Jason was his call sign, who went on to be a 3-star and was our leader, and a guy named Jeff Bart, who ultimately ended up commanding Red Flag years later. We had sort of early space folks, Jim Griswold. We had UK folks in there, and Woody Pye. I mean, this is the who's who, not Dan Caine, but all these other people were just sort of this awesome group of tacticians and leaders that we're all committed to trying to solve this really difficult problem. And we executed the first night of the war, the real first night of the war,
When you talk about 100 ticks, troops in contact, was that specifically focused, obviously, this group that is working the SCUD problem, or is that across the board of the invasion?
No, that was just us out in the West. We were predominantly out in the Western fight. In fact, we were well west of the two prominent lanes. You had the Marines running from south to north, and you had the Army running from south to north, and then west of Lake Tharthar and out in Ambar is predominantly where we were. And so, we had a mixed group of U.S. And coalition allies out there. And between all the forces in theater out west, we had north of 100 ticks that were just solely in that part of the AOR that we were lucky enough to not lose anybody. We did lose some Rangers that we think about a lot up on Haditha Dam. That was the first known use of a chest-worn IED that any of us had ever seen. And I still remember being up there over the dam, and somebody blew themselves up at one of the AOPs. In fact, it was a female bomber that blew herself up. It was just crazy.
I'm going to branch off here because that brings up an interesting point. If we look at what's being waged today, especially when we talk about drone warfare, and then watching the footage, particularly coming out of Ukraine, where, these drones, you see the last moments of someone's life in 1080p. It's changed warfare. Well, back then, IEDs and suicide bombers, again, was a relatively new concept, I think, for us as a fighting force. What were some of the thoughts circling outside of obviously the loss of life, but was it wrapping, nugget around of what is happening? Is warfare changing and those thought processes?
For sure. I still remember being in the stack over the dam when I saw the blast up on the dam, and didn't know what had happened because we didn't have any enemy that were like right in contact at that particular moment. And then as the fires net lit up and they were starting to try to CASEVAC what had happened, and hearing the JTAC on the X talking about what had just happened, I remember thinking, wow, this is a really committed enemy, and we need to be changing the way that we think about warfighting and warfare. And if this enemy is that committed, we need to up our game. And I think I have similar thoughts now as we look at mass and simultaneity with FPVs or autonomy, and our ability as a warfighting nation to pivot at speed to stay ahead of these emerging technologies is going to be really important in the future. And there's a whole bunch of things that we need to do. We need to do better as a joint force and as a Department of Defense along the lines of acquisition reform, so that we can make sure that those young PFCs and E1s and E2s and NCOs have the kit and capability that they need long in advance of something like that.
Yeah, it seems like the game is changing. The drone piece for me, and seeing the footage, when you see like the aerial display, obviously a peaceful display, and the drones are moving obviously en masse, coordinated. You think of like weaponizing one of these systems. It's already been done, but would be absolutely terrifying. And then how does that change the battlefield? I think drastically.
Yeah, it does. And that's where also I'm encouraged by the nation's entrepreneurial community, right? There are great young entrepreneurs, both in the service and out of the service, who are thinking about these things and ahead of it. And that's where I think we have an advantage as a nation, is in, the power of our forces to think about hard things and come up with solutions. And in particular, man, in the joint soft community, most of the smart people are not the O's, it's the E's, and it's really the NCO cadre. And when I look at combat capability development within the SOCOM enterprise, it's the NCOs who are figuring these things out and bundling things together in new and novel ways to try to create dilemmas and or disruption for these things that we're talking about. But it's clear we're going to have to change the way we fight wars and make sure that the mix of combat capability that we're given the ground force commanders and the airborne commanders matches and exceeds the threat, not only in capability, but also in quantity, because quantity has a quality all of its own. And we need to make sure that we're not, giving warfighters great kit, but not enough of it. And that's where I think we need to be really looking hard at what our defense industrial base can provide for the nation.
Yeah, it seems like a few things to look at there, and I know that's been brought up quite a bit. Hopefully, we start solving that and turning that corner. Yeah, because it's only going to get more complex. So we kind of jumped from the SCUD to that. So interesting. I appreciate you going down the rabbit hole with me. The test center. So you go to the test center next. I don't necessarily want to skip over that. That does seem like a great job. But after the test center, you end up as the special assistant to the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture as an F-16 pilot. I got to wonder what
the heck happened?
What is that job? How does that happen? What are you doing?
Well, first, let's not skip over the test center because we cannot. We got to hit pause there. And I've never had a bad assignment, but that opportunity to serve with that group of epically world-class tacticians, leaders, thinkers, humans was very, very special to me, especially at that time in my career. And it's like a motorcycle gang with PhDs, and although none of them have PhDs, but we had this incredible group of folks that were unbelievably committed to getting combat capability to the field right now, from the operational test pilots to the flight test engineers, even to the contractors. And they fielded night vision goggles. They fielded lightning pods and sniper pods. They fielded situational awareness data links. They put JDAMs on Block 30s. They put AIM-9X on Block 30s. They did all of these things in record-setting time. Laughed a lot along the way, but in the end, it did not count until it got to the field. And our ability to execute the SCUD hunt was solely reliant on the test center's ability to create gateways and link 16 to saddle and put lightning pods on A-10s and saddle on F-16. I mean, it's just, you cannot say enough great words about that organization. So, we had a great boss, John Mooney, who'd come in after that. We had great bosses before that, legendary humans as part of that cohort. And I'm very humbled to be a part of that team when I did that. From there, coming out of IF and a bunch of air-to-ground integration work. I had read Colin Powell's book years ago and stumbled on this thing called a White House Fellowship and applied the first year and didn't even get an interview because I was such a marginal applicant, but then figured out how to write these essays a little bit better. And in the second year was lucky enough to get picked to spend a year as a White House fellow. And so in 1964, President Johnson stood up this program which was really designed to take leaders who are early in their career, take them from either the private sector or the military, bring them to Washington with the objective of giving them insights into how senior leaders make decisions at the cabinet or presidential level. And so the law dictates that each year a commission appointed by the president will select between 11 and 19 Americans who come to Washington on a paid fellowship. For us, it's really like ACSC or War College equivalent, that we got credit for it when I did it. And so I was very lucky to get picked through this long interview process where there's probably 14, 15 interviews, I think, at the time, to be one of 12, 13, I think it was, folks in my class. And you sort of interview around Washington, and I ended up getting picked to go to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I couldn't spell USDA, even though it's an acronym. But, and I tell people this all the time. I was super uncertain about what the heck would I do at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the first day of our White House fellowship, Hurricane Katrina made landfall. And we were instantly, our class was instantly involved with the response and the recovery. And the Secretary of Agriculture, I still stay in contact with him. He was a former governor of Nebraska, wonderful leader, wonderful human named Mike Johans. I still remember he walked into my office the very first day and quietly said, what are you doing? And I said, whatever you want, Mr. Secretary. And he said, well, come with me. And we get in his car and we drive over to the Eisenhower Executive Office building, and we are going to this big cabinet level synchronization meeting. And we get on the elevator, and it goes up one floor. The door opens, and on walks Andy Card, who's the president's chief of staff, and the vice president, and a couple Secret Service agents. And I am shrinking into the back of the elevator, hoping that no one will actually say anything to me. But that was a year of great insights for me at USDA. And so the program is designed to really give you deep understanding of how our leaders make decisions between the three branches of government. And, it was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful year. USDA as a cohort took amazing care of me, and I wasn't sure how it was going to go, but they were incredibly inclusive. And so I worked on Katrina. I was early leader that had a chance to write the playbook for avian influenza. If the world knew, they had a fighter pilot writing the high pathogenic avian influenza playbook for the interagency, and a fighter pilot that had marginal grades in college, they would have been scared beyond belief. But it was just a great year. That's how I ended up at USDA.
I'd like to hear about Katrina, what your experiences were with that, or even like what you saw. I don't know what your involvement was there. And then, avian influenza. That'd be an interesting aspect to talk about. Again, not something that you would necessarily find yourself as an F-16 pilot doing.
Yeah. Well, Katrina, was pretty quickly the executive branch and the interagency were pretty quickly all in. And so a lot of what I did early on, especially as a member of the Guard, was connect elements in USDA with the Title 32 state tags and the emergency operations centers, and really was trying to make sure, USDA does way more than just agriculture. They do Wi-Fi in rural areas. They do aid. They do food safety and security. They do all kinds of things that would just blow your mind. And I had absolutely no idea. But, in the response phase, we were really working on how do we lash up the department with the other agency, federal, state, local, and tribal entities that were responding. Not long after that, the president directed that we were going to do a lessons learned project, and so I was tagged by the secretary to lead USDA's debrief, and so we pulled together all of the senior leaders in the department, and we sort of launched this debriefing process. So, by the way, that was not unlike what we do in a fighter squadron. What were our objectives? What was our plan? Did we execute that plan? Yes or no? If not, why not? What did we do? Did we do that plan better? What were the limits that we had? And so I was lucky enough to lead the team that led that debrief, which resulted in us contributing to and me helping to write the overall Katrina lessons learned project. So, I think one of the lessons that I want everybody to take away from this is the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we have as fighter pilots. Everything from the culture to the process of how we plan missions, how we go focus on execution, how we come back and check our egos at the door and do debriefs that are focused on fact and not fiction, and then derive lessons learned that are understandable and applicable to the things that we're going to go do. Those skill sets that we have as fighter pilots apply in things other than just tactical aviation. And so, that was Katrina. And so when we wrapped up Katrina, we were really starting to face this threat of H5N1, high pathogenic avian influenza. And so I basically took the same approach. What are the objectives? What are the things that we need to bring to the table? How do we build a great team? What's our playbook? What's the motherhood and all the things that we need to do in avian influenza? And who are the other players besides the Department of Agriculture? At the time, state was a big player, and of course HHS and other interagency partners.
Did USDA, did they own it? Was that like the lead agency?
Yeah.
And then everyone else follows kind of as a supporting asset?
Yep. Yeah, basically USDA owned it initially. The OCONUS piece is state-owned because it was in Indonesia and places like that. I can't believe we're talking about this on Afterburn podcast.
When we see the special assistant.
I mean, how do you not? But the only way I could think about this is it was no different. Instead of Weasel 5-1 or Conan or all the different supporting assets, I just replaced those warfighting entities with a cabinet department. So, that's the way that my simple C grade average could get my head around all this stuff but yeah, USDA owned the sort of ConOps or playbook for how we were along with the White House. There was an office within the White House, the Homeland Security Council, which we got very close to. And that's ultimately how I ended up going to the White House after my fellowship. Was I just got to know everybody through both the Hurricane Katrina Lessons Learned project and then the avian influenza playbook that we led.
I think we're just hammering home the point. What I made at the beginning is non-standard career path. I think for most F-16 pilots / guard pilots for that matter.
Well, they let me fly for a while in there, so it was that was the only goodness. I was a big confidence builder for the lieutenants out at Andrews because I wasn't very good at the time. So
I find that hard to believe, but
no, it's true.
I'll actually jump back to the test piece because I was going to skim right by it. I think people will be interested. I'm gonna butcher this so you can clean it up afterwards. My understanding, everyone who's listening, you got Guard F-16 units, you got Reserve F-16 units, you got active duty F-16 units. Sometimes you get active and reserve that are sharing iron, but the Guard inherently owns its own iron. That might be, I can't think of a case, but with the test center, what I always heard was, hey, the Guard wants to change X, Y, or Z. they talk to the guys at the test center, and then X, Y, or Z, if the money's there and the time's there, like it can get changed overnight and get, if it's a software thing, square to the jet. We joked when M7 came out, the hog knob for strafe, right? I think it went to a long depress for a second, then put the MFD in north up.
Yeah.
The most disorienting feature ever created and injected into the F-16. We would have actually challenges.
I think I'd eject if that happened to me.
So here's the challenge. So you're out over Western Iraq. Hyde Rimbarger, he was our chief of wing weapons. And it was like, all right, how long can you not, be in the orbit and not get disoriented? So it's middle of the night. You got the town. I mean, you are just in the wheel. There's no way to get disoriented, right? By just looking outside. And it'd be like 30 seconds. You put yourself in north up. But that was a change that someone put in there, and then it wasn't coming out after one. Like, this is terrible. But yeah, I was going to say, like the test center that obviously you're a part of out there at Tucson, that's guard run, that's guard owned, making changes happen pretty quickly.
For the things that we could control, and we own the Block 30, all the pre-blocks. We own the light gray Eagle. We own the A-10. And, the beauty of putting all of the players together in a single squadron. By the way, the test center has guard folks, reserve folks, and active duty folks. So it is this sort of fusion of goodness. And, we had the ability to get the software writers in the same room with us during execution. And so, we would come back routinely and not name your candidate inside this software tape. And they would change it while we were in the briefing room, and they would go out and jam the jets again. And we would fly with that updated tape that afternoon. And we had test pilots with us, some legendary test pilots who were probably more weapons officers than they were test pilots. So we had the ability to do safety of flight and operational test right there. Instead of going to Edwards like we do with the M tapes, we could do it all. We could do it all right there. Which was a very disruptive and quick way of doing things. And, a lot of credit to both our blue patch wearers, Bam Bam Rydberg, Paul Boom Boom Mancini, John Kruzanaskis. Those guys were the blue patch team. And then there's a guy named Mike Schwami, who had been a WIC IP and then come down to Tucson, who for I think probably 6, 7, 8, 9 years was the OFP guy. And he's really the guy that built the Block 30 along with the test guys, the engineers. But, he's the guy that put JDAM and all this stuff on there. And it was a great place to work. And we never, ever, ever, ever forgot that it was all about, especially in that chapter in our history, it was all about getting that tape to the field, out into Iraq or into Afghanistan where it mattered. And that's why the Block 30 is such a, GP war machine. I mean, the M tapes have come along and, the MMC jets are finally getting there, but, hog knobs, air to ground strafe override. I mean, all that stuff were candidates that grew out of the Block 30.
Yeah. It seems like a very efficient way of doing things, especially when that can respond right to the warfighter and give them the things that they're seeing and they need right away. It'd be,
we let the JDAM tape, like Schwami, Mike Schwam, they jammed a tape while I was deployed, getting ready for the war to start. They released the tape. He got on an airplane, flew to Base X that I can't mention. We uploaded the tape on the jets. We taught academics in theater, and then we started to carry our standard configuration load was a 2,000-pound JDAM on one wing and 2 500-pound paveway bombs on the other wing. And that's all because those guys were working 24 hours a day around the clock back in Tucson. I was just recently reminded of, they were working literally in the middle of the night, running jets out on the ramp. They were just crazy dedication. And that's what the test center is. And I hope it always stays that way.
This is not throwing spears at the active duty side, but it is different. So, I mean, if you're even to like take a guess, 'cause I think people, to paint the picture for them, like for if we needed to do that on the active duty side of the house, field some weapon, like it just, again, back in that time frame.
Yeah.
What would that have looked like going through?
I'll let the active duty speak for that one. I don't know.
It seems like it would not be that fast.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the model's different. The 422 and the 85th and all the 53rd Wing, they're incredible partners. And I think it's just a different model. And I think we could probably land somewhere in the middle between the test center on one end and the 53rd Wing on the other. I mean, ultimately, we need to shrink the time distance required to do these changes by massive orders of magnitude, and I think that's where a lot of the joint force is trying to go. And the electronic warfare wing that's down at Eglin, I mean, hopefully we're getting to the point where the F-35 nation and the F-22 nation and the F-15EX folks are all, we're iterating from a software perspective at the speed of relevance, not at the speed of what we might.
Yeah, again, it's not to throw spears, but I think to paint the picture of, while most people might see an F-16 and like same, there's so much nuance and there's so many differences and factors of who owns what, et cetera, that it's more than just, your one each Viper. There's a lot that goes into that tail flash.
It was a great assignment, and it's a very, very special place.
I've only heard nothing but great things. So
it's awesome.
All right, jumping back forward, obviously after the Agriculture Department, you hang around in D.C. again, but now you're at the White House as policy director for counterterrorism.
Yeah.
That this is the 2006 timeframe. So this is kind of, I mean, I imagine the infancy of counterterrorism, homeland security, all these things in that timeframe. Talk to me, what was going on during that period? What was your role there?
Yeah, I was just a rower on the White House staff. I mean, and our job as a policy director is you sort of run the interagency process, which the way the U.S. makes policy decisions is there's sort of different levels. You have the first level is sort of this integrated policy coordination process where you have a particular issue or policy that needs to be thought about. What is America's policy against blank going to be? And you'll bring the relevant stakeholders together to talk about all the policy considerations. And then when it's time for a decision to be made, we'll take that to the deputy secretaries of the departments and agencies. And generally between administrations, those things are called deputies committees. And then if the deputies can agree, then that policy is issued to the interagency and we go forward and do it. If they can't, then we may take it to what's called a principals committee or a national security council meeting. And that's where the actual cabinet secretaries or senior White House leaders come together, or in some cases the president, and they'll banter back and forth on a particular issue and ultimately either reach a conclusion or have the president make a decision. And so, much of what I was doing at that point in time in the early portions of that assignment were just grinding away on the daily churn of threats to the homeland. We weren't too awful far away from September 11th. And so my particular portfolio was really anything that had a nexus to a homeland threat that started overseas but might come back to the U.S. And so it was a lot of intelligence briefings. We'd go to 2 to 3 standing intel briefs a day that were run by the National Counterterrorism Center and sort of cranking out on policy papers and meetings. And so that was sort of the first half of my assignment there. And then in the back half, I was assigned to be a part of a team that wrote the president's national strategy for Homeland Security. So the president hadn't really issued a current one. And so there was a small team of us that came together to consider what should the policy of the United States be on Homeland Security, and what are all the various elements and levers that we need to sort of align the interagency and the international community around. And a lot of whiteboarding, a lot of thinking, a lot of conversations with senior leaders, both inside and outside government, that ultimately resulted in that policy. So in that document. And so did that, and then at the end of 07, early 08, was sort of really feeling like I'd been away from the fight too long, because my last deployment had been in 03, and all my service buddies are on these 4-month pumps. And so was asked to, and lucky enough to get an offer to deploy as part of a joint special operations entity. And so deployed in January of 08 to Balad on the first of several deployments with that organization.
There you weren't flying, but you're working in the operations cell, or working with those units, I guess, doing integration?
I was first the J3 for the organization.
Okay.
And then was the commander. And so I owned fires, I owned the helicopter assault forces, I owned all the airlift, I owned all the JTACs. And so I would routinely go run with the assault forces out on the objective. I was a current qualified JTAC at the time, so would bound back and forth between both sides of the base there.
When did you become a JTAC?
When I was at the test center.
Did you do that? It was a good deal opportunity. You wanted the feather in the cap, or you kind of saw?
No, it was a test that we did. So coming out of Iraq, we were asked to help the UKSF stand up their JTAC training program. We did a lot of lessons learned coming out of the first phase of Iraq around air-to-ground integration. At the time, I was a FAC-A and a FAC-A instructor, so JTAC-I, and the reciprocity existed, where for me to get the ground qual was pretty simple. And so went and got the ground qual when I was still at AATC, and sustained both for a while. So airborne 12 controls, ground 12 controls, and we had a pretty good air to ground program. We believed at the time that the Block 30 and the A-10, the value proposition that they were going to bring to the joint force was really centered around CAS. And that we were starting to see F-22 and the F-35 was on the first pre-production airplanes were starting to get built, and felt like those were going to do interdiction, and our value was going to be in close, decisively engaged ground forces who needed precision. So that's really what took me down that road. And I just did a short requal before I deployed with the Joint Force in January of 08, and was current when I went over there.
I don't know what's been the last couple of years, but probably from that 08, 07 timeframe upwards of 2012, 2013, felt like that was the ALO tour, the air liaison officer. Some of those guys would go through JTAC school. Otherwise, they'd just be chopped to an Army, a Marine unit. Integrated there as kind of a representation, maybe not so much the Marines because they do it on their own, but it
was certainly helpful. I mean, and I got to serve with incredible people. It's to have the opportunity to fly as a FAC-A, and then to be on the ground with the ground force and see, sense, and understand both perspectives really made me a much more understanding leader, and one who understood risk at an much deeper level. I mean, when you're seeing the applications of air power from the other side of a wall, it's a deep appreciation for both sides. So I think it just made me a better leader.
Is there any significant event or mission that stood out in that time period that's kind of etched in your mind? I know you probably can't talk about a lot of the details, but I mean, tell me, what was it like, again, being on the other side, seeing the impacts or seeing the...
I mean, there's a bunch, I spent most of, well, I can't really talk about the who, but these were America's best warriors. And, from long walks to off a helicopter infill, couple click walk to landing within a couple hundred meters of a door. I mean, the collage of memories that I have around those years of running with the ground force were very special to me, and why many of my closest service buddies now are not in our service, and in fact in the Army and in the Navy. I didn't spend much time till later on with the MARSOC guys, but I mean, just to watch these cats in action and to have a first-person view of this is extraordinary, from tenacity on the battlefield to, creative thinking, humor, all of the elements of human experience wrapped into each one of these assaults that I was lucky enough to be on. And, also some pain and some suffering and losing guys. And so it's not all easy, but one of the things that I always came away extraordinarily impressed with and grateful for is the sort of resiliency of the American soft warrior who can take a punch and continue to fight forward, who have the spirit of attack, much like we do in the fighter community, that just never give up. These folks never give up, back to your point way earlier in the podcast. And, it's a very, very special chapter of my life, both the deployments and the stateside, and the honor and privilege of being a part of the Joint Soft Force is one that I struggle to even get words around.
Well, so, I mean, that's 2008. And then if I look at the remainder of your career, while you do go back to DC, you're the maintenance group commander there, you're flying the F-16. I mean, inherently, after that 2008 timeframe, you're in and out of Special Operations Command. You're at 24th Tactics Squadron. You are, in DC. You're in Iraq, all interwoven with Special Operations and, Joint Special Operations.
Yeah, and I'm still hoping they don't come take that away from me when they figure out I'm not an AFSOC guy, and I never served in that great command, and most of my time was in the CAF. But I think that's really the value that I brought, was the ability to translate what those aviators are thinking in the stack into what the ground force could understand, and what the ground force needed being translated into what the air component could deliver, and how to find compromise and how to increase capability between us. And, it was really a special time. And I have been lucky enough to be back and forth between the CAF and the Joint Special Forces community for the latter half of my career. I mean, I think really much of my all my general officer jobs, except for the SAPCO job, were soft jobs. And that's not Dan Caine, man. That is the leaders above me giving me a chance, and thankfully the NCOs around me helping me not jack it up too much. I had great command sergeant majors and senior enlisted leaders and Air Force chiefs that they're all going to be chuckling if they ever see this, but they've poured more into me, Rain, than I've ever given them. And, the gratitude that I have for their investment in me is unmeasurable. And, it's been a really, really great way to serve. And it's a special organization, SOCOM and the subordinate units underneath them.
I can only imagine. Obviously, that led to current role at the CIA. I mean, I imagine coming from special operations in the joint world, that's obviously a great resume piece. Is that your billet? I mean, obviously, there's military and civilian mixed throughout CIA, but I imagine you got plucked based upon your background, obviously, blending these worlds together, because I imagine that's highly needed and highly sought after in your current role.
Yeah, I have no idea how I got picked. You got to go ask the vice chairman and the Joint Chiefs on that one. But boy, am I grateful that I did. While I can't, working at CIA is a little bit like Fight Club. You don't talk about Fight Club, but the one thing I can say is, there are, just like in our service and within the Joint Force, there are world-class professionals over there every single day getting after it in ways that we can't even imagine. And the honor and privilege of serving with each of them is very near and dear to me. And I woke up every day in this job thinking about how I was going to earn the privilege that day to be serving over there. And I still feel that way after 3 years in the job. And, they are the power of the United States. If you can get the Department of Defense and the CIA aligned along with the rest of the intelligence community to go do the things that we need them to do, is unlimited. It's an extremely special place. And, I hope everybody, if you're thinking about getting out of the military or whatever, you go to CIA.gov and check out the ways to keep serving.
Love it. A little 90 left here. So obviously your dad was a fighter pilot.
Yep.
And he served a whole career. Did you guys ever get a chance to fly together?
Did Sluff tell you about this? Or did I tell you about this?
I think it'd be a good story.
It's a great story, and it's a terrible story all at the same time. And I think there's probably a song written about it. My buddies Trip and Snooze. So I after I went to Syracuse, I flew A models in RTU, the small tail Block 10 A model, and then went to get checked out in the C model and came back to Syracuse. And my dad was still in the service at the time. He was the wing commander at Ramstein. And by some miracle, we both end up flying big mouth Block 30s. And so my leadership at Syracuse realized this and were kind enough to invite my dad. We were actually getting jets from Ramstein. They were converting to Block 40s. And so they were getting rid of their big mouth 30s. And many of them were coming to Syracuse. And my dad came to Syracuse, and we got to fly on one of my very first MQT rides. And so it was a four ship led by a guy named Tom Tuna Owens, and my dad was number 2, and another guy was number 3, and I was number 4. And it was a beautiful, beautiful day. And I'm going to start breaking out in hives here in a second. And so we get briefed up, and we step out the door. My mom's there. I mean, we crank up, and our call sign is, I think, Cobra or something. And we check in, and, my old man is fired up. It's awesome. We're going to do a low-level ingress, this long low-level across the Adirondacks to a first-run attack against a dam that's highly defended. And so We got 2 bag jets, Block 30s. We're not dropping anything real, but it's before targeting pods, so it's going to be a 4-ship attack to a reattack is required. We launch and we're up there cruising out to the star point, man. And, flight lead, tapes on, hot mic, standby GX, in place 180 right, 1's good, 2's good, 3, etc. And does the second G-turn rein, and I look out the window, dude, on the G-awareness exercise, and I don't see anybody. I have lost sight on the G-awareness turn of the 3 other airplanes, including my dad. And so the world slows down, and I am thinking about, do I admit this? Do I not? I hold off. I hold off for a while. I'm thinking about, do I crash the airplane? Do I eject? And at the time we had air-to-air TACANs. We didn't have data links, so I'm feeling good because it still says 2, 3, and then it starts to just like that. It just starts to exponentially increase distance, and so finally I gotta freaking admit that force blind. And Tuna starts trying to talk me onto the flight. I'm frantic at this point. I'm like ACM slewable. I'm turning around the star point. I'm in burner. I'm trying to just, dear God, please let me find these guys. And I finally switch back into range wall search. The frickin' air-to-air TACANs double digits. I won't say how far. And I get a radar lock, and they're 25 miles away from me at 480 ground, going away from me. And so I have only one thing that I can do. I light the burner. I pull CATA for the first time in my entire life. And for those that don't know what CATA is, it's this little symbol that will take you on the perfect intercept course. I don't even think about the fact that I'm at 500 feet doing 800 knots outside of that corridor that we're supposed to be in.
Definitely protected.
It is terrible. And I go right across the Lake Placid ski resort at about 700 knots. I don't even see it. And I get back into position at this place called the Initial Point. I'm so far out of position that they've done the entire effing low level, and I am like literally running across the Adirondacks, and I get back into position. Finally, we pass the IP, we do the attack. I got to go home. I'm out of gas. And they are still feeding fuel from their external fuel tanks. And I am out of gas, and we got to go home. So we go up Initial, we pitch out, we land, and, taxi back in and shut down. And my mom's there. My dad walks up to me and just puts his arm around me and says, "I love you, son." And that was it. So I went blind during the GX with my dad. I tell lieutenants this all the time. This is what humility, never forgetting, humble, credible, and approachable. It started very early in my career where I was unable to, and never really would, drink my own Kool-Aid. But yeah, that's when I got to fly with my dad, and it was great, and it was awesome, and it's fitting that I went blind on that ride, but learned so much from his example, and those other fighter pilots that gave us this great airplane, the F-16, and those early days. So yeah, I went blind.
I love it. No one else has done that, so you're the only one.
I mean, I may be the only person to go blind with his old man. That's probably true. That's
incredible. I mean, just the fact that you guys got to fly together in of itself is, I mean, that's serendipity.
Well, it was Syracuse that did that, and I'm very grateful. We got some great pictures of us standing there after the sortie.
That's awesome. Well, as we wrap up here, I hope you'll hang around for a There I Was story. But I want to ask, what am I missing? What haven't I asked you that I should be? What parting shots do you have?
Oh man, I don't know. I think, I think for the young folks that want to do this for a living, or the young folks that are getting to do this for a living, cherish it. And remember that while flying airplanes in the military, at least, is epically cool, it's about something deeper. It's about serving our country. It's about being willing to protect and defend this nation and to work alongside incredible professionals who are equally willing to go to the mat in defense of our nation. And, I didn't figure that out, Rain, until September 11th timeframe. For me, it was really how awesome it was to fly airplanes. And I don't think I really, really understood the meaning of our oath. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States until the days after September 11th. And going to war became very, very real. But it's also an incredible, meaningful chapter for all of us that have the honor and privilege of serving. So for those that are in the service, thank you. And for those that are considering service, whether it's our country or countries around the world, do it. It'll be a fantastic part of your life. And I'm deeply grateful for the chance and to have served for as long as I have. And I'm also grateful for the chance to come on this awesome podcast with you and spend some time with you. Thanks for doing this to get the word out to everybody. Thanks for continuing to uphold the brand of the Mighty Viper. And I appreciate the time.
Well, sir, I really do appreciate it. I lied. I'm going to extend it just a little bit because you mentioned September 11th and how that was pivotal in changing it. On September 11th, where were you and what were you doing?
So I was the chief of weapons at Andrews Air Force Base here in Washington, D.C. That morning, I started out as the SOF, the supervisor of flying. So for those non-military aviators, that's the guy or gal responsible for the safe execution of the daily flying schedule. I wasn't scheduled to fly that morning, but ultimately did. And our squadron had just come back from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where we were preparing to deploy. And so I started the morning as the supervisor of flying, and then as the nation was attacked by those savage terrorists, I ultimately ended up being the mission commander over Washington, D.C. for most of the day that morning after we were scrambled by the White House out of Andrews Air Force Base in response to those terrorist attacks.
That time frame, alert missions weren't really a thing. So now across the country, we have fighter squadrons at 24/7, 365 days a year, just like a fire department sitting on call, waiting for the alarm to go off that scramble and will go intercept an aircraft that might not be talking, might have nefarious intentions, etc. But in that time period, it was, peacetime back home. What did that day look like? So from you going from the SOF to you being a mission commander over DC, I imagine even, getting live AMRAAMs or AIM-9s.
Yeah.
Were those ready to go? Nowadays, again, sitting on the alert shack, those jets are armed to the teeth, ready to go. But back then, not necessarily the case.
No, and it's a credit to our maintenance folks out at Andrews that we were able to generate those airplanes. We had 3 airplanes airborne that morning that were down at one of our local bombing ranges that didn't have any idea what was going on. And as the nation was being attacked, we were called to scramble and get anything that we could airborne over Washington, D.C. The unit at the time was not an alert unit, and our phone call came directly from the White House, directly to our ops desk, And I answered the phone, and it's the White House on the phone. And at the exact same moment, my wing commander walked in, a guy named Brigadier General Dave Worley, and I was able to say, "Hey, this phone call's for you, boss." And we grabbed a couple wingmen, and we went and briefed up a very generic plan, because the threat access was from every direction. We had multiple reports. The phones are blowing up. There's, both World Trade Center towers have been struck. There's reports of a bombing at the State Department. The Pentagon is hit not long after that. We have numerous FAA reports of up to what may have been 10 hijacked airplanes. So you can imagine the sort of chaos of all of this. And, I remember picking up the phone and calling over to the weapons storage area and telling the non-commissioned officer in charge over there, "Hey, I need you to break out the wartime reserve missiles and bring them over the flight line right now. The nation is under attack." And they didn't have a TV over there, so he thought I was out of my freaking mind, and got the message pretty quickly that I was serious about it. And they built up the missiles and ran them over to the flight line very quickly. And while we were briefing, some rules of engagement had come in over the fax machine. Those young folks probably don't even know what a fax machine is anymore, but it was a way to transmit documents. And, for me, and I think many, 9/11 is a series of Polaroid images that are forever etched in our memories, Rain. And one of them for me that I think about a lot is my wing boss standing at the ops desk, or just outside the ops desk in the hallway. I've got all my gear on. We're getting ready to run to the airplanes to crank and taxi into a very unknown situation. And General Worley reads the rules of engagement. And at the end of it, he says to me, "Razin, I don't know what you're going to see out there. And I think you're probably going to have to make some very difficult decisions. But I want you to know that no matter what, I know you're going to do the right thing. I trust you, and I have your back." You want to talk about, Rain, saying the right thing at the absolute right time. And for context, this guy's walked in, the White House is on the phone. There's no command and control structure at this point that would give Dave Worley the authority to launch airplanes off this ROE that's come into a fax machine into the DC restricted and prohibited areas to likely shoot down or ram an airliner filled with passengers. And he's got the wisdom, the maturity, the forethought, the kindness, caring, and love to say to me that. I think about his example a lot. And tragically, General Worley ended up being a 2-star. And after he retired from the service, he and his wife, they had an Army kid who'd passed away. They were very committed to going to Walter Reed and serving with the wounded warriors. And tragically, we lost General Worley and his wife when 2 metro trains collided with each other here in Washington, D.C., and they were killed instantly. And whenever I'm up at the Arlington National Cemetery, a place of incredibly hallowed ground for us, I'll try to get up there and see the Worleys. But we launched into a lot of unknown, and the two ship in front of us just had the gun, and I waited the extra 5 minutes to get 2 AIM-9s and was the mission commander up there for most of the morning and into the afternoon, and got to see and witness incredible examples of courage from our maintainers on the ramp to those first responders in Washington to young tanker crews that took it upon themselves to come up over DC that ultimately ended up deploying not long after it. It's funny, the same KC-10 crew that responded to my guard calls for a tanker over DC, and we ended up having a tanker right over the White House. Several weeks later, I'm in a tick and I can't leave, and I call for a tanker, and that tanker leaves the safe space of the tracks in the southern end of Afghanistan and comes right up over the AOR that we're fighting in, just short of it. And I get on the boom. We're running out of gas. I'm getting ready to jettison my tanks. My wingman's even lower than me, and he can't get on the boom because he's so freaked out. And it's the same crew, same two slick wing captains up front and the same staff sergeant boomer in the back. And once again, the tanker force is saving some fighter pilot's ass. And so, just examples like that, man. My career is filled with stories like that, where I have gotten to serve with incredible people, from fighter pilots at the test center and in the operational squadrons that I've served in, to the SOF community and the assault forces that I've been blessed to serve with, to the interagency teammates. And it's just been, I'm so lucky. And that's why, as I approach my graduation from service, I don't, by the way, subscribe to the term retirement unless you're no kidding retiring. But at least for those of us in the military that are going to go do other things in the next chapter of our lives, I really like the word graduate from service more than the words retire from service. I'm filled with gratitude. So, thanks for asking about 9/11.
Yeah, definitely more applicable there. And it might be cliche to say, but I think it's the people, right? And that's what everyone always says. But there is nothing that compares. It's the maintainers making it happen, the tanker crews, the people you serve alongside with, that make it so special, in my opinion. And again, I always say golf clap to the maintenance guys and gals, because they make
more than a golf clap.
Around. Yeah, and then same with the tanker crews, because I've definitely had them show up over the stack. So then you're just yo-yoing back and forth and
exactly. Yeah, exactly. They've saved a lot of fighter pilots' lives over these last 24 or 5 years, and 100%. We don't say thanks enough to them and the maintenance crews. That's just and I loved being a part of the maintenance group and having a chance to lead that organization. It was awesome to have all these great people. And so for those of you that are thinking about doing that, do that if you get the chance.
Well, sir, thank you again. Thank you for taking the time today. Thank you for your service. It's been an honor to be able to chat with you and hear a little bit about your story. I might have to twist your arm again. I think we still could dig into the weeds a little bit further on some of these pieces, and we're just kind of hitting the wave top. So thank you for taking the time today.
Hey, Rain, thanks for having me, and look forward to staying in contact.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers.